Hello, hi. Welcome to the Vera List Center for Art and Politics. My name is Amanda Palmer, and as curator of the Vera List Center, it's an honor for me to introduce our conversation this evening on non-visibility with media artist Tony Cox, philosopher Christoph Cox, and curator Sohrab Mohebbi. This conversation is organized in conjunction with Cox's debut solo exhibition at Greene Naftali, which is on view until June 8th. Tony Cox is a media artist who lives and works in Providence, Rhode Island, where he serves as professor in the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University. In addition to his current show at Greene Naftali, he's recently exhibited at the Hessel Museum, Whitechapel Gallery, ZKM, REDCAT, SFMOMA, and the Whitney Museum of American Art, Pera Museum, and the Louvre. Christoph Cox is a philosopher, critic, and curator of visual and sonic art. He is the professor of philosophy at Hampshire College, where he teaches contemporary European philosophy and art theory. Cox is the author of Sonic Flux, Sound, Art, and Metaphysics, and Nietzsche, Naturalism, and Interpretation. He is also the co-editor of Realism, Materialism, Art, and Audio Culture Readings in Modern Music. Cox has also curated numerous exhibitions, including exhibitions at the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, The Kitchen, and the Brick and Mortar International Video Art Festival. Sohrab Mohebbi is a curator at SculptureCenter, previously associate curator at REDCAT Los Angeles. Mohebbi's organized exhibitions by artists including John Knight, Dave Hullfish Bailey, Falk Pisano, and Tony Cox. Mohebbi has also worked in curatorial departments at the Hammer Museum, Los Angeles, and the Queens Museum, and for the Los Angeles Poverty Department Theater Group. As a writer, Mohebbi has contributed to exhibition catalogs as well as publications, including Frieze, Art Forum, and is a recipient of a grant from the Creative Capital Warhol Foundation. So this evening's conversation will consider how Cox's videos address and subvert popular rhetorics of power, accounting both for how the material choices Cox makes in his work open up alternative readings of received and naturalized ideas, as well as laying out some of the theoretical constructs that underpin the work. Just to give you a sense of how we anticipate tonight's conversation playing out, Sohrab will begin by talking with Tony through his artistic practice before passing the conversation on to Christoph, and Tony to think through some of the relationships between sound and theory in the work. If there are any questions that you have during the conversation, we do hope that you would hold these until the end. There will be a brief question and answer period after the conversation, and we'd really love to have your participation at that point. I should also mention that the two works that we will screen are Evil 27 Selma, and then we'll also screen selections from One Bang Plus, a dubstep primer. So I think just to start things off, it might be helpful for each of you to tell us a bit about how you know one another and how you came to participate in this event. So Rob, you'd mentioned that you and Tony have been in conversation about his use of video as a reading mechanism for some time. So it would be great to hear from the two of you about what that relationship is between visibility and non-visibility in relationship to video as a reading mechanism. And then another aspect of the work we're hoping to learn about is how Tony engages with sound as a cultural apparatus in the videos, and particularly at the intersection of post-punk and dubstep. It seems apt that you, Christoph, would take up this part of the conversation. As a professor of sonic art. So I think with that, it might make sense to begin with you, Christoph, and we can sort of walk backwards through the group. Thank you.
Sure. Right, yeah, okay. So let's see, I first met Tony some time ago, early 2000s, when actually Tony borrowed a text of mine, I don't know what we want to say, that was actually appropriated with permission, yep. A text of mine, or rather it was part of an interview with Alain Badiou that I did on evil, and we'll talk a little bit about this later because I want to get to the topic of evil, which plays a central role in Tony's work, but also in the Greene Naftali show. Of course, I said, yeah, great, use the text. And then Tony and I started a kind of friendship, trading work back and forth, trading theoretical and video work, but also realized that we have all sorts of musical taste in common. And I think Tony's sent me more music than any of my friends, which is saying a lot. And I'm super grateful for it. Anyway, we can talk more about that. So there's a lot of connections, and we've been working together for I don't know, at least a decade and a half. Yeah.
And yeah. Okay, finally. That's a pretty true account in terms of how we know each other. I've always been a kind of great admirer of Christoph's work, though. From before we knew each other, I'd seen both texts that he had written for Cabinet magazine, and had also seen things in The Wire, which I'm still old-fashioned. I still subscribe, and I occasionally read through. Unfortunately, you're not doing much work for them lately, so. And it was, I think that text, the interview on evil, reached me at a very particular moment where I was beginning a process, and I think we're supposed to talk about process to some extent, where I was gathering texts around particular subjects in the aftermath of 9/11, and the rhetorical trope of evil and what is evil and what is its, opposite, the good, was something that came up quite a lot, and it was really bracing to read that interview. So it actually made me, triggered me to contact you in the first place, and I'm glad I did, and we've been very friendly ever since. All right.
Well, I first met Tony Cox at a Mexican restaurant in Los Angeles.
That is true.
He had a show at REDCAT curated by my friend Sohrab Mohebbi, who used to be a curator at REDCAT and now is at the Hammer Museum, which was a really important show because I just moved to Los Angeles and Tony did this show, and I thought, oh yeah, I mean, serious things do happen in LA as well. And,
right, of course.
And it was a great show because it was really ambitious. It was brought a lot of his work together and had, I think, like 3 programs or maybe even 4 that rotated during the time of exhibition. So I don't think anyone really saw that.
But show. That's okay.
And Christoph, I know, was a student at Bard, and I audited his class, and it was one of the best classes I basically never took. So I'm really actually happy. The thing is, I really thought that I will be like the third wheel here, and like
you thought that too about the experience of putting the show together, and you always kind of acquit yourself really, really well.
All right. Well, we're gonna kind of get into this, but just to as a way to start this conversation, we're gonna watch a piece that is actually in the exhibition, Selma. And the reason we thought we can start from this is that it's a piece that really was maybe a very important departure point for how this show came together. And Tony kind of brings up a lot of ideas around his thoughts on, using video as basically a non-representational medium, which I think is we definitely have to talk about that, but I think that, and also kind of like explaining some of those ideas. I'm not really going to talk about the piece a lot because I think it's actually, once we watch it, then we can actually talk about some aspect of it, and that as a way to kind of talk about the work, and then we'll, take it from there. Just wanted to also thank everyone for hosting us. Thank you, Amanda, for and thank you for being here.
We should make sure that goes all the way back to
All right, notes.
Okay, so maybe we're just gonna take it from here, and there's a lot that comes. There's a lot that you discuss in this video, but this notion of let's say, a visual template that television provides, and worse on you going back to the Montgomery bus boycott and how that also, like, in a way, opens a space for imaginary and the lack of that basically visual template. And that is, in a way, your use of video, which is mainly being used to show and as a tool for visibility and representation. Right. And you have consistently used it actually as a reading device or as a listening device, and kind of maybe use it as a space for imaginary rather than the image. So maybe just to start with, you can talk about how you started to kind of conceive of the works in this way and this kind of process of decision making, and how it came about as a place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I came out of doing a lot of work with images in relationship to text and in juxtaposition with music also. And at a certain point, I think for me, it was a real challenge to maybe step away from the archival image in a certain way, maybe because people sort of, I don't know, had gotten used to it or expected it, or there was a notionality that somehow this was, I don't know, a way to encounter, let's say, historical events in a particular way. And I don't know, I began to question it even though I was doing that and working with it. And I was wondering if there were things, events that might be better imaged in the imagination of the viewer or reader than in kind of either finding archival material or creating, fictional material to kind of fill that space. It became kind of an interesting exercise for me to think about it almost as reading being a kind of picture making, and sound also being a kind of montage. In sort of like some of the effects, if you will, of what we normally think of either as pleasure producing or knowledge producing in terms of media, with less in terms of actual material to work with. And I think the question of like how to read the work always has been kind of an important one. And I'm interested in it kind of being, again, not settled and not sort of linear in that way. I have some notions that readers or viewers need to make choices, and that those choices may have stakes and repercussions. For, you make a decision to take one view of something, and then you have to let go of other aspects of that reading and legibility. And I think that's maybe in some ways maybe a kind of accurate representation of the way that we deal with representations of the social on a regular basis. But we don't want to admit that. We want to believe that we always already have an incorporated, picture and a full understanding. And it's like often we don't, for all sorts of, determinations and conditions that we face as, viewers, readers, and as subjects.
I wanted to mention that I think there was a stage in between. So I mean, I don't know. You can. I'm talking about your work. You can say no. That's not actually right. But okay.
Say what you like.
But there's. The sort of the some of the earlier pieces, some of which are in the show at Greene Naftali, are very have that documentary image. And then there was when I got to know you, actually there was a set of works that had these sort of three streams, right? There was the sound stream that was almost always pop music of some sort, and then there was an image. The piece you sent me, I think, first was an image shot by you, I believe, right?
Actually, by some Confederates, but
okay, yeah. Okay.
But it could have been.
Yeah, okay. so appropriated from Friends, yeah. And but
I gave them instructions.
Right.
And
of Manhattan on the Circle Line, right? And then there was this sort of dense theoretical text that ran through the middle. It was like Alain Badiou, followed by Walter Benjamin, followed by and there were this real conjunctions of layers that, as you said, you really had to make choices as to what you were looking at, listening to. Anyway, but just wanted to mention, because there's kind of interesting bridge, and then, I mean, maybe, Sohrab, I think one of the questions you're asking then is like, why did that image then why did the non-text image drop?
Right.
Yeah, why did that, anyway.
well, it doesn't drop forever. It drops for long periods, I will grant you. Yeah. And I think again, it's kind of like, for me, I think it was a challenge to move away from, that support of, the archival image. Maybe because I didn't want to necessarily make another image. Mm-hmm. The images already existed, and yet they were, often not representative of the things that I wanted to talk about. So it was always kind of a quandary as to what's the place of this image, which I want to contradict, most of the time at all costs. So it's kind of like, well, why is the image there? Do you need the image? And if not, can text substitute in the imagination, perhaps, of the viewer for that image, which often they already know and have already seen. Mm-hmm. And maybe there's, a kind of dialogue about the already seen and the already read in the work too, because a lot of the evil pieces are not obscure texts. They're not secret in any way. Mm-hmm. Often, they either derive from, critical sources, or just as often from journalistic sources. So these are things that kind of already have readings and associations attached to them. And maybe to some extent, and this may be true in a certain way of the way the music is used, I'm counting to some extent on there having been prior readings and experiences of these things, so that maybe I can complicate and contradict them. It's like, I know that there's, normative reading conditions. It's kind of like we were discussing a little earlier about how I don't do period soundtracks, because it's sort of like, well, you already know that space and that alleged history, but what I'm interested in is something that's complicating that, or behind that, or in contradiction to that. So what would be the point of, kind of matching? If I matched them, I would have to contradict it somewhere else in another layer, because it's like too much agreement. It's a kind of stereotype, or it's kind of like, oh yeah, period music, as though, again, music is representational in a way in which we probably suppose it is not. That it really is reflective, and it's like, well, reflective of what? I mean, it's certainly temporally linked and historically linked on a particular level, but I guess I want to ask questions about those relationships, both temporal, cultural, and maybe political, in terms of what we accept and what we expect, and
Yeah, no, it's just very interesting in seeing the show that's at Greene Naftali now, looking at the images from the Watts riot in relationship to then looking at the text-only pieces like Selma. You have a deep understanding of the inadequacy of images and their capacity to flatten these historical narratives. And so then in something like Selma, you wind up having these very intense affective disconnects or dissonances where you have this sort of like build with Morrissey into these like, you think you understand the fantasy future that's potentially happening in like, what if we could be as equals as X in this instance or iteration? And you realize there is this sort of conceit to that fantasy, like that positioning it as a future sort of utopian hope also arrests it in time as not necessarily has happened, but that the hope has happened.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting intersection that would be helpful to hear more about.
Yeah, I think for me, it's also, we were beginning to talk about this, I think, a little earlier too. It's like, it's the unrealized aspect that interests me more than the realized, what actually happened. The conditions of possibility and the conditions for potentially reanimating and extending these projects, which are largely incomplete. It's
Political projects.
Political projects that are incomplete. And there's this way in which perhaps if you think about it almost in a kind of trope of nostalgia, it's as though those things have already happened and we wish to relive them. My argument would be they actually haven't really happened yet.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think then, as you also work a lot as you teach in university, so that's like part of your work. Sometimes there are two things.
Teaching is part of it.
Yeah. So there's this notion of, like sometimes I feel like maybe you wanted to teach some of this stuff and you decide to make a video. But did you ever think of it like that? Like, do any of these could be like a placeholder for a lecture? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Placeholder. In some ways, they could be.
They could.
Yeah, definitely. And in one case, actually, the piece we're going to show later began as a lecture.
As a lecture, right.
Or, some of these materials are from, texts that are meant to be read in particular contexts, sometimes teaching contexts or educational contexts. They could be read in those contexts. But of course, they're texts from other contexts. But yeah, I do, in a basic way, think that my work could have a pedagogical function, but I think it's maybe more abstract than something that, again, in a normative sort of situation and economy, hopes to teach.
Right.
It's like, I'd like to teach certain modalities of abstract thought. But I can't, do that. I'm not a philosopher, so, or at least not a practicing one. But there is a kind of perverse, practicing something almost without a license or not in its proper context and place that is of great interest to me. And I think it's one of the things actually that drew me to a text like the Our Literal Speed on Selma was that, he's kind of doing a mediatic analysis and a kind of performative analysis of something that we're used to seeing kind of just as a representation or a media object. We're not used to thinking about the conditions that produce the legibility of these very striking images that do, call people to conscience. Those images do come into a context, into a kind of readership and into certain representational technologies and our desires, for and around them.
While we're talking about sort of formal things that you started off with, Sohrab, one of the things that these texts do, Tony almost always uses appropriated texts, and as properly footnotes them at the end, right? Like this is where they come from, right? That's not supposed to be a mystery, but on the one hand, you foreground those texts, but you also, and I'm curious to hear later on what other people think, seeing some of this work for the first time. You also, in a way, make those texts difficult, make them difficult to read in a way, right? You're trying to listen to the, like the hook in the Smiths song, and yet there's another text, right? And you're into both, but you've got to, So anyway, I just wonder if you could say a little bit about the question of difficulty, right? So Tony, to prepare for this, right, sent us the complete text of the Our Literal Speed, and that's so lovely to read as like a set of paragraphs. But the claim is not like, it's so much better that way, but it's just to say that the mode of reading in your videos is something very different. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, right? Here it is. There's this text, and we're giving it to you for this amount of time, and there it's gone. So anyway.
Yeah, I think it's obviously going to be a challenge for readers to read them and understand them in kind of normative terms. But I'm also thinking about them, almost in a way as objects or in relationship to a kind of maybe histories of mediation or other uses of text, as in like structuralist film, except that I want to kind of double down and complicate those relationships and actually, make an argument for a kind of double or triple materialism or double or triple reading, with an understanding that there will be some slippage and some loss in terms of coherence, traditional nodes and modes of meaning production, but maybe making the gamble that there will be a kind of productivity from that action. I early on decided that, for instance, I didn't want things to be fully consumable in a single reading. And often I think that's kind of held up in some ideas around what media can and should do as a kind of ideal. And I feel that that's not really what critical texts often do. They're kind of difficult to read, and they require a certain kind of attention or maybe multiple attempts and protocols. And I kind of like the idea that the work, may not be fully understood or engaged in a kind of singular setting. That, hey, if you read the text at your own speed, you could have a very different reading. And I understand and appreciate that. But I'm also interested in kind of folds and slippages and maybe even contagions of affect, say, from the form of the music and your knowledges and desires around that. Some people say that it makes them approachable and consumable, but not in terms of their content. Maybe at a kind of formal level or as image. Yeah. As opposed to as this thing that we, approach and understand, kind of instantaneously.
Because it's never a paragraph, and it's rarely even a sentence. It's a part, it's a chunk of text, right? Some of those things you go on the gallery website, for example. Some of these, make for these kind of killer sound bites, right? Others don't so much. Yeah. But so in a way it functions as an image, functions like a little bit as a meme, a really rapid meme, right? I can see all those different ways it works.
Also, it's along the same lines. I always thought that this is like a take on film essay and taking it really to the film. And it actually is a film,
exactly.
Film essay.
There is a way in which,
it's not an essay film, it's a film
essay. It's a film
essay.
There's also this kind of like logification of the words that you're performing with this, where they become these sort of like memes that to me seems like mimetic of what happens with a group like Gang of Four, sort of like luring people into engaging with a Marxist ideology, Yeah. And so it's not even necessarily that it makes, as you're saying, it doesn't necessarily make the ideas more accessible, but it makes them very seductive.
The other thing that
perhaps because you can't quite get all of
you always want more.
The other thing that I feel like really stands out, there are a couple of things that you always mention, like for instance, form and content. Tony Cox, can you explain that?
Concept.
Sorry, form and concept.
So at the end, so it's concept plus form.
Yeah.
Tony Cox. Yeah.
And then like the same with the titling. There are these kind of numbers and versions. There are certain kind of decision making. These are two different questions.
Yeah,
maybe,
they are. But
the first, maybe we can talk about the form and concept, and because it also goes back to like how you start to make this certain kind of series and certain kind of works.
Well, I will maybe talk a little bit about my working process. It's kind of there are kind of always at least two or three things going on at any time on my computer, more often than not. And I gather material around categories and try to do, related things. And sometimes I just gather things, collect things. And then sometimes I go back and then completely, or try to approach something and deal with it in a kind of comprehensive way. But sometimes I don't. And sometimes I also project forward in a numbering system and then go back and fill in what I perceive to be gaps between things. It's not a linear process by any stretch of the imagination. And I think I kind of want to leave a trace of the fact that there is more material that I have not yet processed, or things that I'm projecting into the future that I will then have to come back and think about, the interstices between those things. I don't know. It's like the idea of like sitting down and linearly plotting out, a series from beginning to end and doing it in that order just seems to be a kind of impossibility for me. For one thing, it's easier to think about things sometimes when you're at a certain distance from it. And so if I'm working on a different project, a different subject matter, or a different corpus of material that I've gathered, it's good to be able to switch to something else before proceeding with the next thing. And I often, develop things to a particular point, and I'm not satisfied with some aspect of the project, and I will set it aside, sometimes for years. And then sometimes I come back to it and I say, what was wrong with me when I, put this thing aside? And then other times I know, kind of what, in retrospect, what I think dissatisfied me and are able, to address it in some way. So it varies from piece to piece, but I usually have 2 or 3 categories of things open. Yeah, and I kind of like to go back and forth between them, and then I can maybe progress, on something from the other series.
It's so interesting that you're both reorganizing time and this linearity for yourself, but then you're also essentially sort of decolonizing time that would be imposed on you from an outside structure.
Yeah, it's, in some ways maybe it's not unrelated to the gesture around, I often work, not always, but often work with sound that I'm listening to while I'm working on a project, not, sounds historically associated with whatever moment is being represented. And I'm interested in that because I'm kind of always trying to tune the relationship between what's being represented and where I'm located in relationship to it, maybe temporally. And so I don't like the idea that they, must match, or everything must be contemporary, or everything must be from a particular moment in the past. It's sort of like, why? If something historical resonates, for me, then that is present in a certain way. And if something unrealized in the past resonates for me, then that's also present in a way.
Maybe that's
I was going to say, yeah.
So we can get to show a part of the other one bang plus piece.
Yeah, and
then
that kind of deals with
yeah.
presence or things haunting other
Right.
things, or dilations in time in a certain way. Yeah,
And versions.
and versions,
music.
and
Yeah.
that trope of
Right.
how to work through things.
Do you want to quickly introduce that? Or,
Yeah.
Well, could you actually say how you came to name the piece as One Bang plus Dubstep?
Oh, that's very easy. In recursion and in making up systems, I did a piece called One Bang, and it was a discography of 10 years of listening, accompanied by excerpts from an essay by Christoph Cox on techno, rock, and their relationship to Deleuze's concept of body without organs, which I found kind of fascinating combination of subjects. And it was kind of really a kind of useful way of kind of framing and summarizing this activity that I had kind of undergone for a period of time. And then I said, at one point I had projected, speaking of things you project, that I would do another 5-year period, another 100 albums. And then I said, why? You know, why am I making kind of the double of the thing that I made before? Why don't I do something, you know, kind of tilted on its side? And so instead of making it a discography, it came out of actually an essay, a talk that I gave a number of times, and I sort of worked on the talk. And as I worked on gathering my quotations and juxtaposing them, I said, well, this would be an interesting script for a piece. And then it can live on, and I don't have to give the lecture anymore. You know, so kind of a reversioning of something that I had already done. And again, maybe it is also related to your comment about you know, questions of pedagogy and the lecture as a form or a kind of mode for thinking things through or working with ideas. And then, you know, it's interesting to take that material and some of the sonic residue of it, because I think it's kind of important in a perverse way maybe to present things that might seem evidentiary, but you know, I leave it to viewers to determine, you know, what their relationship is to it. I kind of posit it as, you know, this could be a documentary in a way, or an essay film about dubstep and hauntology, and so it's kind of like. And those are connected terms in, quote unquote, the literature around those formations. And then I kind of maybe pull at the boundaries a little bit. And yeah.
Maybe it's important to say that we're just watching an excerpt of this video. It's 37 minutes. We thought that maybe we can watch.
Oh my goodness.
But where do you want to start? Do you know?
Actually, this is not One Bang Plus. This is actually another work. Speaking of things unreleased, it's a piece called, what is it? It has a strange title. It's like I can't remember the title even, because it's like it's unreleased. So that's not it. Wow, that's strange. I mean, it has the right title,
But it's not the right.
but it's not the right image.
Isn't it the tail end of that?
It's kind of the well,
because it's 20. Well, anyway.
No, I actually think this is an even rarer thing for me. It's a literary adaptation. I took a passage from James Baldwin and juxtaposed it with a kind of cut up and looping set of commercials for BMW and the Apple iPod. And they were talking about, the title is Seamless Integration. And I thought, James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time, juxtaposed with this representation of various individuals who represent musical genres, and just sort of cutting back and forth inside this one, two 30-second commercials over long duration was kind of an interesting way of kind of extending and sort of maybe questioning the so-called integration technologically that's being represented in the ads.
And naturalizing it.
Yeah.
Do you want to go to the first part in this then? Or
I'm puzzled.
I think I watched this online, and in fact, like if we watch from the beginning or from here on, there's
Okay.
like the conclusion that we'll get to and read. It's actually kind of. We'll get a little bit into that essayistic format. I mean,
Cool.
All right.
this is what we have right
Let's
now,
do
so
it.
we can watch.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a copy of the file, so we can actually play the thing. But yeah,
What would you prefer to do?
he's looked at it. I'd kind of like to bear out his reading and
Sure.
see what happens.
It's also like more improvised. So.
Yeah,
there you go.
It is completely improvised. See, Sohrab, you were right. I reversioned all that material.
This is what you get when you work in versions.
Yeah.
You get yeah.
Did I already use that?
So how did you use it already? So is it the same sound and visual and new
No.
text, or everything's different?
Different. The text is different. The sound is different. The other piece, seamless integration, actually uses the original sound of both commercials, and when it's kind of cut and looped, I believe that's what the sound that's what the sound is. It's from the original source material, but the text is think it's the first part of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, the letter to his nephew, I think it is. People have told me that I will never get permission for that. That's one of the reasons why it's unreleased. But
I think Amanda asked earlier about the question of permissions, and it'd be good for you to say what the question was. Do you get permission for everything you appropriate? And Tony said,
probably not most things. I mean, if there are cases where I can contact the artist directly, and I think there's a likelihood that they will understand and appreciate what I'm going to do with their material, I would. But yeah, if it were a question of dealing with the rights and lawyers, that would be a very different kind of work. And yeah, I don't have a team of lawyers to do that. So,
I wanted to ask a bit about something that I think connects the two pieces, or two pieces we've watched, the SELMA piece and the One Bang Plus piece, and that's these questions of sound and time and visibility. So in the SELMA piece, the sort of thesis of that text is that visuality, or the visual, to capture something visually, to document something, kind of locates it in the present and allows that present to become past. And when that present is past, it's done. And it also has a relationship to knowledge. So it's not just, it's the present that becomes past, and then we can say, I think the quotation is something like, I know that, or I know about that. I know about that. Yeah, exactly. That's something I know. Whereas the idea with sound is that sound has a kind of, allows for a kind of a sort of fuzzier set of temporal properties that it can, because it doesn't locate something in, and the term that's used throughout that is evidence, right? It doesn't just evidence of something that happened. Rather, it allows for that something to remain futural, and here, like a political possibility, the possibility of racial justice, for example, to be in the future, even if it's an item of the past. So that something from the past could be rescued from its pastness, because it's not quite, it hasn't been sort of nailed down via evidence, right? And the sonic somehow, and I guess the textual too, allows that to be sort of reappropriated as a possibility, as a future possibility. And then in the dubstep piece, so much of this, I mean, the earlier part of this is all about the question of hauntology, right? So Derrida coins this term in the early 90s as a pun, right? Like, you know, if you're French, you say ontologie, you say ontologie, the same things, right? But hauntology, this idea that the present is always kind of haunted by a past and also haunted by a future. I don't know. I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about that, both in the dubstep case and in the case of the Selma piece. I mean, I've got more to say about it, but I'd love to hear you to say. Yeah.
Well, I think that question of not the past not being quote unquote over and done with, you know, and that it's reverberating, you know, is a good metaphor for, I think, how the past sits, and especially it seems in phonology, in phonography rather, it kind of always recurs, and there's a way in which it's kind of experientially present and intense, and sometimes tells of something unresolved and something in the future. That would be maybe my approach to it. And also, you know, when I think about like sonic practices, like the remix or like dub, there is always this movement. It's not just present, and it's not just the thing that's recorded. It's kind of a relation to a kind of present time, technology, context. It seems to me that it's never completely played, you know, and played out. It's constantly, at least potentially appropriable for reuse. And that's kind of
some new version.
Some new version can always emerge that either complicates what we claim to know about that musical genre or that particular song or melody, right? and sometimes it's kind of an interesting approach to, say, a field like historiography. What if history were written with the version emphasized and foregrounded, as opposed to, a kind of, again, supposition of evidentiary relationships to truth, whatever.
I know about that.
I know about that.
Yeah, I was thinking about, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those Smith songs, right? So this is a kind of remix. Well, the earlier piece that we watched, the Selma piece, is this kind of remix of these five actually, because they're quotations on the sides.
Right.
These Smith songs, and like you wouldn't think of those as, I don't know, I wouldn't, right? Think of those as political pieces, right? The Smiths, they're sort of associated with, kind of lonely, moody, sort of. They have a kind of affective quality. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I know I'm gonna complicate that in a second. Okay. But what I think you do with that is you sort of say, like, there's a set of like affective possibilities there, right? Like in these Smith songs that are like. That's a possibility for a mode of feeling and a mode of being that actually can be connected to political energy. Whereas something, like a political song, right? Like this is a song that's about politics. It can do the exact opposite. It can do this is sort of, what Jacques Rancière says about political art. Like it can basically be the least political art in the world, because it can say either this is what you should think, right, or this is politics and tough luck, you're not in it, or something like that. Like, whereas this is like,
these both sound like quotes from, bad bad versions of my work, or things that I might seize upon. It's like
appropriate. Yeah. But anyway, do you, think like these. We were talking earlier. These post-punk instances. Whatever we think of, Joy Division, Smiths, Gang of Four. These have been kind of recurrent features in your work, and you would, and they're. I don't know. Maybe.
I think looking maybe a little retrospectively at them, it's almost like, there may be political possibilities for pop forms. They are not sufficient in themselves. They are not a political program, but they may be pointers to or residues from class conflicts, for instance, which is something that isn't usually a kind of subject matter for American pop music. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in those forms. And I often think what would happen, sort of in the way that our literal speed text, what would happen if you wanted to read these things as political? You could argue that they are not, explicitly not. But is part of our affective relationship also related to maybe that possibility? The desire for politics, and maybe not necessarily in the place where we most expect it and normatively would expect that discourse to appear.
You think part of, speaking of politics, and maybe we can almost open up soon, but just as a kind of a tangent about politics of the work, is how the work kind of operates within, let's say, the art world or the art system, and how what does it mean in terms of politics of representation now or in the past decades, in a way how you place the work that in fact kind of consistently questions those tropes. I would say that an artist would stick a Kanye West song and put a bunch of very kind of orgasmic imagery on it, and then
that would not be me.
That would not be you. So I just feel like it's important to kind of think about these positionalities, because I feel they something that we've talked about. The political question is really who has the right not to represent, and how you carry that on as as an artist. I think that's such an important kind of contribution. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up in that way as well. I don't know if that's kind of it's a question, also a comment, but I feel like it's something that I thought about a lot, and we talked about a lot in thinking about this exhibition.
Yeah, I think in some ways a kind of I'm not going to say ambivalent, a kind of critical relationship maybe to this idea that spectacular representations in combination with certain tropes of popular form is a formula for the political. I guess I just disagree that there may be other paths to it, and maybe the least spectacular path, at least, I don't know, maybe has more potential for connection to people in daily life and in terms of what is possible. The idea that, it's sort of like if everything has to be really kind of spectacular, violent, I think it probably animates too, my questioning of, this kind of ideology and performance of the rant, which is, kind of rampant in this culture. It's sort of like, would it be possible to just sort of frame and isolate these things for a second, and so that we could actually look and think about them?
It's striking because you do take these incredibly spectacular forms and narratives and strip them of the spectacle. And then I think that for a popular imagination that engages with them, that spectacle is sort of residual or like resonating in the back of your mind as you're engaging with the material itself. And then you add another popular cultural quality to it. So it is this sort of like layering of different apparatuses, but it never reaches that level of spectacle that would overdetermine what the meaning could be. And so I think it's something about that lack of an overdeterminacy.
I was just going to point out, so in the exhibition there are two lightbox pieces, and both of them are rants, right? One is a Kanye West rant.
Or a series.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, well, yeah, okay.
But,
a collection of rants.
Yeah. It's sort of like I took a specific incident and looked for the most comprehensive version of that incident, and then I looked through collections of, and looked through, collections of rants, And so, I kind of wanted to work both sides of that street. It kind of started with a specific incident, but then one of the things that I was thinking about and trying to think through is this is happening all the time. It's a serial activity. This is a quote unquote career. It's kind of like, when will it stop? And
the other one is this Lars von Trier, and that is a single rant. And it's just kind of, we were talking about the ways in which the images are these serial images that wipe away. In that case, you're reading these like, in the lightbox, you're reading the fragments of this rant, like almost like cells of a comic, right?
An animation,
and you're watching them coming, and you can see them coming, and you just want them to stop. You don't want the work to stop.
Please stop here.
Shut up there. That would have been a good time to stop. No, he just keeps on going, right? And you sort of watch it going, and you can. It's like almost in that format. That's just a very different conception of a very different way of reading. It's a very different sort of temporal mode than this one. Anyway.
I think I was drawn to that idea because, again, process. They're made of these stills, and they're very simple transitions. And so it's kind of like, these are just stills, and they could be a composition. They could be a two-dimensional composition. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they be? And also, the kind of checkered history of production of that piece, which, started as a set of illustrations for an article, which was never published, that then kind of like, there's another instance of these rants, and you could use another rant as part of this thing. And it's sort of like, I had these sort of collections of rants, and, it's like, well, what do I do next? And obviously there's a videotape, of course, in the show that talks about what I do next. More rants, but I'm so glad.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say I'm so glad that in our discussion, though, the rant as a kind of form didn't get overdetermined as well. We kind of chose some things as framing devices for those.
Following on that, I think we just have such an incredible audience. It would be wonderful to see if anyone here has questions that they might want to pose to the panel. Or we could go with more rants.
I can go.
Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering if you could talk about the color choices and visual stuff in.
Yeah, sometimes I get bored and make changes, but other times I like to stay with a very, very consistent palette. I'm always, making kind of very straightforward and maybe flat-footed references. In the case of many of the works in the Evil series, it's red, white, and blue, patriotic colors. But on the other hand, there's sometimes a twist, like in Evil 16 Torture Music. It could signify just as well the British flag, because there's British music that's kind of referenced in it, and British practices of enhanced interrogation or torture referenced in it. Actually, I did the series that the light boxes came from, also in red, white, and blue. And there was also, again, a kind of weird dialogue between, I think the Norwegian flag, the American flag, the British flag, because each of the three sort of speakers in that series. And also to some extent, primary colors, of course, in terms of a relationship to kind of modernist codes and forms, trying to, kind of tap those already existing reservoirs of association and knowledge, and then maybe complicate them because it's not quite that narrative and not that sort of formal relationship. So, sometimes I have used colors that reference a source in the text itself. Like once I made a piece that references the book design of the book that the text came from, but that's kind of relatively unusual.
Hi. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about any sort of, like the sort of internal logic that you seem to, that you might subscribe to when you were talking about how you like title some of your works and, sort of jump ahead but leave, certain gaps for yourself to fill in, and then, whether or not that sort of indicates a broader logic that you might subscribe to, or like some sort of guiding, sort of pursuit,
I mean,
like by setting up that linear, like.
I think it is a questioning of linearity, and I would even maybe be a little bit more specific and say that I'm interested in notions, say, that I kind of inherit in two streams. One, on one hand, possibly somebody like Walter Benjamin, and also on another hand, someone like James Baldwin, people who, in modernity, who question the notion, say, of progress and linearity. So that's maybe a general kind of principle, and in line with some of the things that we've been saying about the relationship between the future and the past, and complicating or decolonizing that notion of, how things proceed and how they are kind of narrativized and structured.
I mean, yeah.
Thank you. With regards to the Selma piece, you were talking about the Smith songs and this idea of them being maybe connected to a certain time. And Christoph, you were talking about kind of certain like maybe subcultural aspects or certain kind of affective assumptions we make. But then for me, there's a part of that is also Morrissey, and the figure of Morrissey, who continues to live and breathe and make music.
Oh, yes, he does.
And have politics and rant. And so I wonder if you could comment a little bit about this kind of figure of like celebrity or pop star or kind of personality behind some of these texts.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I could probably talk all evening about it. I will say something maybe specific and particular, not so much about his current relationships, to media and celebrity culture. But one of the things that I historically found interesting about Morrissey was that often in his lyrics, he would stage and restage that relationship, where he would not necessarily be the main character, but that relationship of, let's say, the fan or the critic or the industry and its way of packaging and presenting the artist. And that's maybe a gesture that resonated with me as a gesture, even while he was still performing within that, you could say, code and economy. I don't know whether that, addresses your question. But yeah, I mean, I don't feel that there's necessarily a kind of hard outside. And in some ways, I find him interesting because he kind of plays between, he sort of represents the situation as much as he also performs the character. And so I kind of, at least earlier on, made a kind of an assumption that that was a knowing act, to end a song by saying, this is the last song I will ever sing. Oh, I've changed my mind again. Good night and thank you. It's sort of like, what kind of gesture is that?
Okay, can I just pick up on that and maybe ask you a little bit more about it? I think one of the parts of part of what I get from the question is kind of like, does Tony's work, need to be responsible then for the living, breathing, and sometimes, politically awful Morrissey? And so, but that gets at these questions of time that we were talking about, right? So if you fix someone in the present, like, racist X, right? Then does the whole previous history have to get read that way, or are there still affective possibilities in the music that are separable from the artist, separable from the living being? I mean, all of these are I don't know. Maybe you have more to say about it. Maybe Tony does. I'm just curious. Yeah.
Yeah, I think obviously these ideas are especially pertinent now. Let's say, of how does one separate an artist from their art? It's more a part of our cultural conversation than I think it's been in a while.
And that's a particularly interesting question for me, because if you think about it as something performed, then it's not just the way someone is. Mm-hmm. It occurs in a kind of cultural and economic and political context. So it's not just the antics of one person. It's kind of a system and a way of looking or understanding even what cultural practice is, for instance. It's like, you have to make these outrageous statements again to gain visibility. Why or how is that, and what does that mean? Yeah. But I'm sorry I cut you off in mid-question.
No. Yeah, I think perhaps, maybe where I started with it was, but not so much this idea of like, are you accountable for Morrissey or something?
I wouldn't pretend to be accountable.
So much as, to me, the way I read that piece, and then, you were talking about the Kanye piece, and then I think the role that music plays in a lot of your work, for me, is sort of the shadow of the personalities behind those voices and how that relates to my own personal relationships to the music, certain kind of subcultural, again, relationships to the music and these sorts of things.
I was just going to ask if there are
Yeah, go.
So, if there are any more questions, we have time for one more.
Yeah. One question I had for you all, and maybe this is an uninteresting question, and if it is, just ignore it. questions of sort of reading practices, what I asked before about how one sees a work like this, like the Selma piece for the first time, and what one does and what one is capable of and incapable of when you're sort of listening and reading and watching and all those things. I don't know. I'm just sort of curious about to sort of get an account of your experience of these. I mean, these pieces I've seen a bunch of times, so I don't have the same relationship. But anyway, again, take it up if you want, and if you don't, forget about it. Yeah.
I have, maybe, I don't know if that serves as an answer, but I was curious. I'm not very familiar with the work, but it was very interesting to me in those juxtapositions. It made me, to answer your question, think of like speed reading, and how like in speed reading you associate, like you try to see in just one image preconceived ideas of those words put together as an image or as a meaning, or these sort of tapping into like memory of meaning, but also juxtaposed with the music, which was also interesting for me. I'm French, and only recently I started to be aware of the lyrics of the songs, as before was kind of a mix of kind of more melody and kind of a rough idea. So as maybe a heritage of Godard, I'm like always like between like one thing's happening in my left ear, one thing on the right, one thing on my left eye, on the right, or whatever. So I was like very confused in that way of kind of jumping between like preconceived blocks of information, tapping into different parts of my brain and memory. So yeah, it kind of relates to your question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I've talked about Tony's work in the past, Godard is one reference. I mean, it's obvious. It's not a formal thing, right? It's like, you wouldn't mistake one for the other, but the
primary colors might be a clue. Though.
Yeah, primary colors. Yeah, but just all these registers of information. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's also like this. We have to wrap up, but Godard talks about like in the Gigot like group, and we talked about it a little bit. I mean, he talks about, the sound was really loud. We have to bring the sound down, and you jack the sound up and put the text on it. So I thought that was an interesting kind of conversation to be had as well, like how sometimes it's, like think about even like Derrida, you talk about Glas, and like it almost seems like reading two books at the same time sometimes watching a video,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously one of the, at least in my mind, a kind of primary modern experience is taking a train through a landscape while reading and also listening to music. Mm-hmm. Maybe that makes me, a bad reader, listener, or viewer, but those things do happen. They're kind of like parts, if you will, of modernity and its offshoots and problems,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
And
simultaneity. Yeah.
Not to hog the mic, but like that question about reading, and like not to bring it back to the formal, but there was one piece in particular in the gallery show at Greene Naftali that to me felt like this alignment, this like really amazing and like powerful alignment of the experience of reading with the content and the formal presentation, which was this very aggressive, like the bright, like concert grade, like LED screens,
right.
That in the small space of a gallery, it's almost painful to stand that close to something emitting that much light,
mm-hmm.
And for this one piece, that hasn't been talked about tonight, but, talking about torture and the practices of torture, I'm interested in, I found just myself thinking very critically about that experience of reading and your use of the formal presentation to sort of inflict, a certain experience on people. So that's something that really resonates with me.
Well, those are things definitely that I think about. People often ask me about that piece in particular, whether the sound needs to conform. It's sort of like, it's not really just about that, it's about you could argue, conditions of viewing and conditions of listening, the fact that you can't turn sound off, qualities that are not just limited to the volume of the sound, and ways to think about, your relationship to a particular type of viewing experience. I thought you were actually going to take the direction of are, all pieces arranged in the same way, and I was going to say, no, they're not. Some are even more difficult and more painful as reading procedures, but I have tended away, from doing like a word by word, faster maybe than you, or just a little bit faster, those kinds of, things. I've become more interested in kind of poor readings of texts that should be legible, than making things more and more difficult. But in terms of the presentation, it was important in terms of the scale, and I've been thinking a lot about architecture, conditions for reading. That's something we haven't talked a whole lot about, but in doing larger exhibition or installation projects, one thing that I'm particularly attentive to are kind of the means of delivering the imagery and the scale of the presentation of the material. And I do think that they can have, very strong affective effects. And that was one of the things I think I was thinking about in terms of, putting these things inside a room and those kinds of both retinal and environmental effects that they do have. So,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much.
Yeah, that's right.